That empty tin can was found in the thick morning fog. It looked too bright for the season, a small shine against a world of grey. It rolled out of the muddy centre of no man's land, bumped over frozen clods and the lips of old shell holes, then slowed as it neared the American wire. It came to rest against the barbed strands with a dull metallic tap. A sentry waited, listening for the snap of a shot that never came, then reached out with a bayonet and dragged it back. There were no leaflets inside, only a crumpled slip of paper, dampened by dew. In clumsy English it carried just a few words. Cigarettes. Any more? Corporal Tom held the note as if it might still be warm. He could feel the rough grain of cheap paper and the colder impression of a stranger's hand in the hesitant letters. The message was not the kind of reply he had been trained to expect. It was not an argument, not an insult, not a threat. It was a question that belonged to ordinary life. He looked up toward the opposite line. The German position lay under the wet, bone-deep fog of an Italian winter, silent and still. The mist pressed the landscape flat, stealing distance and muffling sound. Somewhere beyond it were men who aimed at the same wire. Only days earlier, Tom had been doing what he considered the most futile job in the world, throwing propaganda leaflets at the enemy hidden behind that fog. It was the winter of 1944, on Italy's Gustav line. The war here had sunk into a bog, like two exhausted beasts breathing at each other across cratered mud. The line hardly moved. When it rained, trenches filled and men worked pumps and buckets. When it froze, boards turned slick and boots stuck. Between shellings and patrols, the days were long, the nights longer, and everyone carried the same heavy tiredness in their shoulders. Tom's company faced a German unit that seemed just as worn down. Both sides lived in a rhythm of waiting, repair, and sudden violence. In that rhythm, Tom's assignment was simple on paper. Every day get leaflets to the other side. They were printed with surrender appeals and safe conduct passes, neat blocks of German promising humane treatment. The officers called it psychological warfare. To Tom, it felt like paper pushed through mud. Sometimes the mortar teams would fire canisters stuffed with leaflets and let the burst scatter them. More often it came down to arm strength. Tom would wait for a lull and for the fog to thicken, rise just high enough to see the far parapet, then hurl bundles of paper into the grey. And the results were always the same. The leaflets scattered like dead autumn leaves, then were ignored, blown away, or used for whatever purpose paper served in a trench. On a rare, clear morning, Tom had once seen through binoculars a German soldier crouched behind broken stone with an American leaflet in his hand, not reading it, just using it. The sight would have been funny if it had not fit so perfectly. In a letter home to his parents in Iowa, Tom joked bitterly, "We're advertising to rocks." The real turn began on a day when he felt as exhausted and hollow as the mud itself. At dusk, after another round of throwing paper into nothing, he slid down against the cold trench wall and pulled out his rationed pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes. The cardboard was softened at the corners from being carried. He stared at the box, grateful for the simple fact that he still had something to smoke. And a near mischievous impulse rose in him, not out of bravery so much as a private desire to do something unscheduled. He took one out, lit it, and let the smoke scrape his throat. Then, as if flicking a coin into a dark well, he hurled the rest of the nearly full pack toward the German line with a careless overhand throw. Out of habit and obligation, he added a fresh stack of leaflets to the throw. A meaningless gesture, he told himself. A small funeral for a ruined day. He slept badly. The night was damp, the trench smelled of wet wool and smoke, and the fog returned before dawn as if it had never left. Then the tin can rolled back, and inside it was the note. "Cigarettes. Any more?" The words were simple, but they pierced the heavy silence between the trenches like a needle. This was not a response to slogans. It was an answer to the plainest need to stay alive. Tom and the men around him exchanged looks. A strange mixture of curiosity and unease spread through the damp air. One man muttered that it had to be a trick. Another said quietly that if it were a trick, there would be a bullet in the can. The note lay on Tom's palm like proof that on the far side there were hands and hunger. They decided to answer, not with more leaflets, but with real goods. They did it without calling an officer and without naming it aloud. A few packs of cigarettes and a couple bars of chocolate were gathered from pockets and ration piles, the kind of small luxuries men guarded like photographs. They placed the items into an empty tin can because a tin can could roll, and it could be hooked back, and it looked like nothing more than trash. At the next dusk, when visibility dropped and the world turned to shadow again, Tom threw the can to the same muddy patch that had quietly become a transfer station. Waiting suddenly became specific and miserable. Men pretended not to care, yet they checked the mud patch whenever they could. They joked to keep the fear at bay, but the fear was real. If a machine gunner decided to fire at movement in the fog, if someone on either side reported it, the small ritual could end with bodies in the mud and charges on paper. The following morning, the can was gone. In its place lay a worn German uniform button tossed back. A day later, it was a small photograph, clearly a copied print. A young woman held a child in her arms. Her smile was blurred by cheap ink and damp. It looked like the kind of picture a man would pull out on a long night and hide again before anyone could see. A fragile set of rules formed without anyone speaking them. The time was always low visibility, dusk or early morning, when faces became shapes and distance became mercy. The place was always the same patch of mud, a strip of ground no one claimed except as a place to die, and the content shifted from one-sided giving to silent exchange. Life in the trench was crushingly dull and suffocating. Days were measured by cold food, wet socks, and artillery walking up and down the line. In that life, this tiny interaction across a border of death brought an eerie kind of comfort. It had nothing to do with politics or ideology. It was about the bite of nicotine, the sweetness of chocolate, and a shared longing for whatever tokens of home could still be carried in a pocket. Through binoculars, they occasionally saw heads rise cautiously on the far side at the same hours, a silhouette pausing, then retreating. Once, in a rare break in the fog, Tom caught a brief, wary look from an enemy face before it ducked back down. No one waved. No one signaled. The exchange lived in that narrow space between recognition and denial. But comfort made men careless. Before long, the notes changed. Instead of thanks or simple item names, a handwritten list appeared. It was written in the same stiff English as the first note, and it tried to make the exchange orderly. 1 can of beef in exchange for 2 packs of cigarettes. 1 full chocolate bar in exchange for 5 rifle rounds. The list was crude, but its meaning was sharp. It took the exchange and turned it into commerce. It also crossed a line that could not be explained away as boredom. When the platoon leader saw it, his face went hard and grey. He slapped the paper onto a damp crate. His voice was low, but it hit like a hammer. "Look at this. All of you, look at it. You think you're making friends? You're supplying the enemy. You're trading our goods for their ammunition, their parts, their information. This is aiding the enemy. Stop this stupidity now. That's an order." No one argued. Intent did not matter once a price list existed. In the army, anything that could be written into a report eventually was. The order came down. The exchanges stopped on the surface. The trench returned to normal, the normal of sporadic sniping, harassment fire, and the constant threat of shells. But the sense that something subtle had existed did not vanish. Men still glanced at the mud patch out of habit, as if waiting for it to prove that the old rules could return. A few men complained that the order punished ordinary need, not malice. Others said need was exactly what the enemy would exploit. Tom heard both sides and said little. He kept thinking about the list, about how quickly a small kindness had turned into a ledger. Then, days later, an older soldier in the company, known for being strict and unbending, quietly packed his gear and walked toward the rear, toward where the military police were stationed. The crisis came fast and cold. 2 MPs took Tom away for questioning. Their coats looked cleaner than the trench, as if the rear area had different weather. They spoke in practiced tones and asked the same questions from different angles. Who started it? What was traded? Whether any information was passed. Tom tried to keep his answers small and exact, but he could hear how any sentence might be made to sound worse on paper. The button, the copied photograph, every traded item was confiscated as evidence of unnecessary contact with the enemy. 1 MP held the blurred photo by its corner as if it were contaminated. Another tucked the note into a folder with the same care he might use for a map. They put Tom in confinement for 3 days. The cell was narrow and dim. The air was stale. Time lost its normal shape. Meals arrived through a slot. Footsteps came and went in the corridor. In the silence, Tom replayed the tin can rolling through the fog and the platoon leader's iron face, over and over, until the images felt like they were carved into the wall. He imagined his parents waiting for letters and getting none, imagining what they might assume. He remembered how confidently he had told himself it was harmless, how easily he had believed a private ritual could stay private in an army that wrote everything down. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, but the army had a way of making nothing into a record that followed you. In the end, the company commander shielded him. When the MPs pressed, the commander only waved a hand, his tone flat. "A young man under front-line strain. A little boredom and foolishness. I've already chewed him out." Tom was released and sent back to the line. The men looked at him differently, complicated and guarded. No one spoke openly about the exchange. It had become a thing that existed only in glances and in the way voices dropped when an officer came near. Then the commander summoned him alone to the command post. Inside the tent, the light was poor. A map lay spread across a makeshift table, its edges held down with ration tins. Alongside the commander sat a lieutenant Tom had never seen. The lieutenant was quiet, neat and clean in a way that did not match the front. His boots were not caked with mud. His collar lay flat. He looked like someone who belonged to a different war. He carried a small notebook that stayed dry inside his jacket, and when he listened, he did not squint into distance the way frontline men did. He listened as if the important terrain were inside people, not on the map. The calmness was unsettling. Tom had met officers who talked about courage and sacrifice. This lieutenant talked with the quiet precision of a clerk, as if war were a delivery problem that could be solved with the right routing. The commander pointed at Tom and said, "That's him." Then he turned to Tom, voice official. "Your little stunt made its way upward, not to the judge advocate, to another office." He paused. "This is Second Lieutenant Levin from the Psychological Warfare Office. They have a question for you." Lieutenant Levin looked up as if he were assessing a piece of equipment. "Corporal, according to the report, you established a channel for direct exchange with the opposite line. Primitive and unstable, but it existed." Tom nodded, throat dry. "If we give you real resources," Levin said, leaning forward slightly, "not so you can trade for buttons and photographs, but better cigarettes, first-rate chocolate and materials designed for a purpose, could you turn this dangerous little barter into a larger operation? Something that makes more Germans want to put down their rifles and come across?" The tent went silent. Tom understood at once. The platoon leader had seen only aiding the enemy. These men saw a ready-made delivery lane that already reached into the German trench line. His accidental act, his small flicker of curiosity or sympathy, was being folded into a larger professional machine. He had very little choice. Refusing would not erase what had already happened. With a complicated, reckless sense of having already stepped into deep water, he nodded. The operation escalated and its nature changed completely. Tom no longer had to sneak around. He received a supply of special goods. The cigarettes were popular American brands, packed in clean cartons that looked almost obscene beside trench rations. The chocolate came wrapped like a gift, glossy paper that did not belong in mud. Everything smelled of storage rooms and offices, of places where hands stayed dry. But tucked alongside the comforts were no longer friendly tests. They were carefully designed psychological ammunition. The materials included images printed to show German senior officers enjoying lavish meals in Paris while frontline soldiers froze and starved in the mud. The contrast was blunt on purpose, easy to understand at a glance, the kind of picture a man might stare at without admitting he believed it. There were safe conduct passes that looked almost real, high-quality paper, clear stamps, detailed instructions on how to surrender and be treated well. And based on scraps of hometown talk traded earlier, excerpts of German local papers appeared, hinting at worsening conditions and trouble back home. "This is not scattershot distribution," Levin told him. "This targets the small stretch of line where you made contact. It targets whatever unit is there and whatever mood they are in. What you will use is the fragile trust you built around basic survival. Our job is to take the desire to live and make it into a clear path. Put down the rifle and walk over, and you live. Tom listened, and something in him tightened. The first Lucky Strike pack had been thrown in exhaustion and impulse, almost humane. Now, every action came with a purpose that did not require kindness. The war had found a way to use his impulse without sharing his feelings. Still, he did as instructed. He balanced the weight of each tin can so it would roll instead of bursting open, testing it in his hands like a man testing a grenade. He wrapped the papers against damp, slipping them inside oilcloth so the ink would not bleed. He checked the passes twice, making sure the stamps were sharp, the instructions readable, the promise of safety clean on the page. Then he delivered the packages to the same muddy spot, at the same low visibility hours, until the routine felt as regular as rations. Each throw carried a brief sting of doubt, not about whether the goods would be taken, but about what he had turned into the courier. The other side still collected them. Sometimes there were gifts in return, small, personal items that looked chosen rather than random. Through binoculars, Tom watched for changes. He could not hear what the German soldiers said, but he could see patterns, men gathering in tighter knots, heads bent together, papers passed quickly and hidden. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He could not tell whether the message was taking root or simply being mocked. The only clear fact was that the channel remained open. The breakthrough came on a morning when the fog was so thick it felt like the world had been wrapped in wet wool. Visibility was less than 20 meters. Even gunfire sounded distant, as if swallowed by the grey. A lookout lowered his voice and reported urgently, "Sir, there's movement over there. Something's wrong." Tom grabbed the binoculars. In the haze, he could make out slow shapes near the edge of the German position. It was not an attack formation. It looked like men moving under a heavy decision. Then a pale, irregular object rose into view and waved with effort. It was a bedsheet tied to a stick, a white flag. Under the sheet were 3 German soldiers, ragged and hollow-faced. Their coats hung loose. They held both hands high, fingers spread wide. In their fists were several sheets of paper. Even in the fog, Tom recognized the shape of the safe conduct passes. They stumbled through the mud of no man's land toward the American wire, their steps unsteady, but their direction certain. Along that small segment of the line, the world went dead quiet. Men who had been talking stopped mid-sentence. A machine gunner eased his finger off the trigger guard, but kept the barrel trained forward. Someone whispered for a medic to stand by, then immediately hissed for silence. No rifles cracked. No one shouted an order. It was not mercy alone that held the triggers. It was also calculation. If the Germans were surrendering, shooting them would poison any future surrender. If it was a trick, firing too early might be the mistake that started an assault. Men on both sides understood, without saying it, that one wrong reflex could rewrite the day. Tom watched them come closer. The youngest walked in front, eyes wide, scanning for a sign that he had chosen death instead of life. When they reached the barbed wire, he spoke in broken English. "Surrender, we surrender, like the papers say." They were taken away carefully, disarmed, searched, led down the trench toward the rear. Tom watched until the fog swallowed them. The fog thinned. Sunlight broke through cloud and fell on the same cratered ground, unchanged. Minutes later, the German line seemed to wake up. A few angry, pointless shots rang out. Soon the shelling resumed, landing in no man's land, as if to erase the silent interruption that had just occurred. Everything seemed to return to the beginning. Tom received no medal. A quiet success like this would not appear in bright headlines. Not long afterward, he was transferred off the front to a steadier rear area post. He never saw the 3 Germans again and never learned what became of them. But their faces stayed with him, especially the fierce will to live in the eyes of the youngest man. That look was not noble or heroic. It was simply human. The war ended at last. Tom went back to Iowa, married, raised children, and lived a calm life on a farm. He rarely spoke about the war like many of his generation, but years later his daughter recalled that her father would sometimes sit alone on the porch with an unopened pack of Lucky Strike in his hand. He would just hold it without lighting one, turning the pack once or twice in his hands, staring out across the fields for a long time. The gesture looked trivial to anyone passing by, but his daughter remembered how still he became, as if he were listening for something that did not belong to Iowa at all. She once asked him what he was looking at, what he was thinking about. Tom would shake his head, show a faint smile that was hard to read, and say nothing. For him, that pack of cigarettes that rolled through no man's land may not have lit a psychological victory worthy of history books. It may have been something smaller, a tiny, warm spark in an absolute wasteland of humanity. A spark that, for a moment, let enemies see the same coldness and the same hunger in one another. A spark that led a few men on a fog-choked morning to make a choice based on the simplest agreement in the world: cigarettes, food, and the need to stay alive. Some victories are never counted in any report. They do not change the grand course of a war. They only quietly alter the lives of a handful of ordinary soldiers. In the deepest night, behind the hardest defensive line, what connects people and erodes hatred is not always artillery and flame. Sometimes it is only an accidentally thrown pack of cigarettes carrying a trace of kindness and an empty tin can rolled back, hollow yet somehow full of the hope to survive.